On February 26, 1991, at exactly 4:22 in the afternoon, something happened in the Iraqi desert that would change military history forever. A single American tank company, just 9 M1 Abrams tanks, engaged an entire Iraqi armored brigade. 72 T-72 tanks, the pride of Soviet engineering, faced these American machines across 3 kilometers of flat, featureless sand. What happened next took exactly 23 minutes. When the dust settled and the thermal sights cleared, every single T-72 lay burning. 72 destroyed tanks, 0 American losses. Not a single M1 Abrams was even damaged. The crews inside the Soviet-designed tanks never even saw what hit them. They died without understanding why their shells bounced harmlessly off American armor, while American rounds punched through their tanks like paper. This was not an accident. This was not luck. This was the result of a catastrophic intelligence failure that began 6 years earlier in a cramped apartment in Arlington, Virginia, where a Soviet spy named Dmitry Volkov sat copying documents that could have prevented this massacre. He had stolen the technical specifications of the M1 Abrams tank. He had detailed reports on its revolutionary armor composition. He had test results showing exactly how to defeat it, and when he sent this information to Moscow, they ignored every word. This is the story of the spy who tried to save 2,000 tanks and the bureaucrats who wouldn't listen. This is the story of how arrogance, politics, and institutional blindness led to one of the most lopsided military defeats in modern history. If you find this story compelling, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We bring you detailed research narratives about the moments that shaped our world, stories that mainstream media often overlooks. Your support helps us continue this work. Now let's go back to where it all began. The year was 1985, and the Cold War was approaching what no one knew would be its final chapter. In Moscow, the Soviet military establishment was confident, perhaps too confident. The Red Army possessed the largest tank fleet in human history, over 53,000 armored vehicles spread across Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. The backbone of this force was the T-72, a tank that Soviet generals believed represented the pinnacle of armored warfare. It was fast, relatively cheap to produce, and equipped with a 125mm smoothbore cannon that could theoretically destroy any Western tank at combat ranges. The Americans had something else entirely. In 1980, they had introduced the M1 Abrams, a tank that broke every rule Soviet designers thought they understood. Where the T-72 prioritized quantity and simplicity, the Abrams prioritized crew survival and technological superiority. Where Soviet doctrine assumed tank crews were expendable assets in a war of attrition, American doctrine treated each tank and its crew as an investment to be protected at all costs. The most revolutionary aspect of the Abrams was something the Soviets could barely comprehend: its armor. The tank was protected by a classified composite called Chobham armor, a British invention that the Americans had refined and improved. This armor was not simply thick steel, it was a carefully engineered sandwich of ceramics, steel, and other materials that could defeat both kinetic penetrators and shaped charge warheads. The exact composition was one of the most closely guarded secrets in the Western world. Dmitry Volkov was born in Leningrad in 1951, the son of a naval architect and a schoolteacher. His father had designed submarines during the Great Patriotic War, and young Dmitry grew up surrounded by technical drawings and engineering discussions. He inherited his father's analytical mind and his mother's patience, a combination that would serve him well in his chosen profession. By the age of 30, he had risen through the ranks of the GRU, Soviet military intelligence, to become one of their most valued technical analysts. In 1983, Volkov received his most important assignment. He was sent to Washington, D.C., under diplomatic cover with a specific mission: penetrate the American defense industry and obtain technical intelligence on their latest weapon systems. The M1 Abrams was at the top of his target list. Soviet tank designers were growing increasingly concerned about reports filtering back from military exercises. American tanks seemed to operate with an effectiveness that shouldn't have been possible. Something was different about these machines, something fundamental, and Moscow wanted to know what. Volkov arrived in Washington during the early days of the Reagan administration's military buildup. Defense spending was increasing dramatically, and thousands of contractors were working on classified projects throughout the Virginia suburbs. Security was theoretically tight, but the sheer scale of the American defense industry created vulnerabilities. People talked, documents circulated, and Volkov was very, very patient. His breakthrough came in the spring of 1985 through a contact named William Reeves. Reeves was a 47-year-old engineer at a defense contractor that manufactured components for the Abrams fire control system. He was also deeply in debt, struggling with a gambling addiction that had destroyed his marriage and was threatening his career. Volkov identified him through careful observation and began a cultivation process that would take nearly 8 months. They first met at a bar near Reeves's office, a casual encounter that Volkov had carefully engineered. Over the following months, Volkov presented himself as a Canadian businessman interested in investing in defense technology. He bought drinks, offered sympathy about Reeves' divorce, and slowly, methodically, built a relationship based on trust and mutual benefit. When he finally revealed his true purpose, Reeves was already too compromised to refuse. The information Reeves provided was extraordinary. He had access to technical reports, test results, and manufacturing specifications that laid bare the secrets of American armor technology. Over the course of 18 months, Volkov received detailed documentation on the composition of Chobham armor, including the specific ceramic compounds used and their arrangement within the composite structure. He obtained fire control system specifications that explained how American tanks achieved their remarkable accuracy. He gathered intelligence on the thermal imaging systems that allowed Abrams crews to identify and engage targets at ranges Soviet tankers could barely imagine. Most critically, Reeves provided test results from Aberdeen Proving Ground, where the Army conducted live fire experiments against various armor types. These documents showed exactly how Soviet ammunition performed against American armor, and, more importantly, what modifications might allow Soviet rounds to defeat it. The test had revealed several potential vulnerabilities, angles of attack, and ammunition types that showed promise against the otherwise impenetrable Chobham array. Volkov was meticulous in his handling of this material. He photographed every document using miniature cameras provided by Moscow Center. He made detailed notes in a personal cipher he had developed. He cross-referenced information from multiple sources to verify its accuracy. By the autumn of 1986, he had compiled what he believed to be the most comprehensive intelligence assessment of American armor technology ever produced by Soviet intelligence. The report he prepared ran over 300 pages. It included detailed technical specifications, vulnerability analyses, and specific recommendations for Soviet countermeasures. Volkov identified the exact composition of the Chobham armor's ceramic layers and proposed modifications to Soviet ammunition that could defeat them. He outlined the capabilities of the Abrams thermal imaging system and suggested tactics that could minimize its effectiveness. He even included recommendations for upgrading the T-72s' own armor based on principles he had reverse-engineered from the American design. In November 1986, Volkov transmitted his report to Moscow through secure diplomatic channels. He expected commendations. He expected his analysis to revolutionize Soviet tank design. He expected, at the very minimum, to be acknowledged for what he had accomplished. What he received instead was silence. To understand why Moscow ignored Volkov's intelligence, you have to understand the institutional culture of the Soviet military-industrial complex in the 1980s. The design bureaus that created Soviet weapons were not merely engineering organizations. They were political entities, fiefdoms controlled by powerful directors who had spent decades building their empires. The Uralvagon Zavod factory, which produced the T-72, employed over 30,000 workers and contributed billions of rubles to the Soviet economy. Its director, a man named Yuri Konstantinov, had personal relationships with members of the Politburo. Questioning the T-72 was, in effect, questioning Konstantinov, and Konstantinov was not a man who tolerated questions. When Volkov's report arrived at the Ministry of Defense, it was initially received with interest. Technical analysts recognized its value. Engineers who reviewed the material understood its implications. But when the report reached the level where decisions were made, it encountered a wall of institutional resistance. Konstantinov and his allies argued that the intelligence was either fabricated or exaggerated. American propaganda, they claimed, designed to intimidate Soviet planners and waste resources on unnecessary modifications. The T-72 was proven technology. It had been tested extensively. It was the backbone of Warsaw Pact armored forces. To suggest it was fundamentally vulnerable to American tanks was not just technically implausible but politically unacceptable. There were also genuine technical objections, though these were secondary to the political calculations. Some Soviet engineers doubted that the ceramic armor described in Volkov's reports was practically achievable. The manufacturing processes required seemed impossibly precise by Soviet standards. Others argued that even if the armor existed, it couldn't possibly be as effective as claimed. Their own tests suggested that large-caliber ammunition would defeat any reasonable armor arrangement. They had underestimated American engineering before, but surely this was different. The result was bureaucratic paralysis. Volkov's report was neither accepted nor rejected. It was filed. It was discussed in low-level meetings. It generated a few modest research proposals that were never funded, and slowly, inevitably, it was forgotten. The T-72 continued rolling off, production lines unchanged. The tactical doctrine for armored warfare remained unmodified, and Dmitry Volkov, watching from his post in Washington, grew increasingly frustrated. He sent follow-up reports. He requested meetings with senior officers. He even attempted to bypass normal channels, reaching out to contacts he had cultivated in the general staff. Every attempt was blocked, diverted, or simply ignored. By 1988, Volkov had been recalled to Moscow and assigned to a desk job analyzing Western technical publications. His career, which had once seemed destined for the highest levels of Soviet intelligence, had effectively ended. The spy who had stolen the secrets of America's most advanced tank would spend the rest of the Cold War translating magazine articles. While Volkov's intelligence gathered dust in Moscow archives, events were unfolding that would put his warnings to the ultimate test. On August 2, 1990, Iraqi forces under Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. Within hours, the small Gulf Emirate was under Iraqi control, and Saddam had declared it the 19th province of Iraq. The international response was swift and overwhelming. A coalition of 35 nations, led by the United States, began assembling forces in Saudi Arabia for what would become Operation Desert Shield. Iraq possessed one of the largest armies in the world, hardened by 8 years of brutal warfare against Iran. Its tank force included approximately 5,500 armored vehicles, of which roughly 1,000 were T-72s, the most advanced tanks Iraq possessed. These were export variants, slightly downgraded from the versions used by the Soviet military, but still formidable machines by any reasonable standard. Iraqi generals believed that their armor would pose a significant challenge to any attacking force. They had used these tanks effectively against Iranian forces. They understood armored warfare. They were confident. The Soviet military watched the buildup with intense professional interest. This would be the first major test of their armored vehicles against Western equipment since the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. That conflict had produced mixed results, with Israeli tanks generally outperforming Soviet-designed vehicles used by Arab armies, but many Soviet officers attributed this to the superior training and tactics of the Israelis rather than any fundamental equipment advantage. Now, with American M1 Abrams tanks preparing to face T-72s directly, the truth would finally be revealed. Some officers in Moscow remembered Volkov's report. They quietly circulated copies among trusted colleagues. A few raised concerns through back channels, suggesting that the outcome might not favor Soviet designs. These warnings, like Volkov's original intelligence, were dismissed. The T-72 was a proven system. Iraqi crews had extensive combat experience. The Americans had never fought a major armored engagement, whatever advantages the Abrams might possess. in controlled testing would surely evaporate in the chaos of actual warfare. Operation Desert Storm began on January 17, 1991, with an air campaign of unprecedented intensity. For 38 days, coalition aircraft systematically destroyed Iraqi air defenses, command centers, supply lines, and exposed military equipment. The Iraqi army, dug into defensive positions in Kuwait and southern Iraq, endured this bombardment with diminishing capability. By the time the ground war commenced on February 24th, Iraqi forces had already been severely degraded. But the true shock came when American armored units finally met Iraqi tanks in direct combat. The first major engagement occurred at a place called 73 Easting, a map grid line in the empty desert of southern Iraq. On the afternoon of February 26th, elements of the U.S. 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, moving east through a sandstorm, encountered defensive positions manned by the Tawakalna Division of the Iraqi Republican Guard. Captain H.R. McMaster commanded Eagle Troop, 9 M1A1 Abrams tanks leading the American advance. As they crested a slight rise in the terrain, their thermal imaging systems detected Iraqi armor through the swirling sand, vehicles that were invisible to the naked eye. The Iraqi tanks were dug in, facing west, waiting for attackers they could not see. They never saw the Americans coming. McMaster's tanks opened fire at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. The 120mm sabot rounds, traveling at over a mile per second, struck Iraqi T-72s with devastating effect. The American crews watched through their thermal sights as turrets were blown completely off their hulls, as ammunition compartments detonated in catastrophic explosions, as vehicles that had seemed so formidable were reduced to burning wreckage in seconds. The Iraqi tankers attempted to respond, but their return fire was hopelessly inaccurate. They couldn't see their attackers, they couldn't gauge the range, and when their shells did find targets, they bounced harmlessly off American armor exactly as Volkov had predicted they would. In 23 minutes, Eagle Troop destroyed over 70 Iraqi armored vehicles, including multiple T-72s, without suffering a single casualty. The Iraqis never landed an effective hit. The most sophisticated tanks the Soviet Union had ever exported had proven utterly helpless against American technology. What Volkov had warned about in his dusty reports had come true in the most dramatic way imaginable. Similar scenes played out across the theater of operations. At the Battle of Medina Ridge, American tanks engaged the Medina Division of the Republican Guard, destroying approximately 200 Iraqi armored vehicles in a single afternoon. At Phase Line Bullet, M1 Abrams tanks knocked out Iraqi T-72s at ranges exceeding 3,000 meters, distances at which Iraqi gunners couldn't even identify their targets. The Iraqi crews fought bravely, but bravery couldn't compensate for fundamental technological inferiority. They were blind men fighting opponents who could see perfectly in any conditions. The statistics from the ground war, which lasted exactly 100 hours, were staggering. Coalition forces destroyed approximately 3,300 Iraqi tanks, of which roughly 1,800 to 2,000 were T-72s or comparable Soviet-designed vehicles. American tank losses totaled 18 M1 Abrams destroyed, of which 9 were the result of friendly fire, and not a single one was destroyed by Iraqi tank fire. The exchange ratio was essentially infinite in favor of American armor. Soviet military observers attached to the coalition were devastated by what they witnessed. These were professional officers who had spent their careers preparing to fight the Americans. They had trained with T-72s, they had developed doctrine around its capabilities. They had genuinely believed that Soviet armor represented a credible threat to any opponent. Now they watched as everything they thought they knew was incinerated in the desert, along with the vehicles they had helped design. General Vladimir Lobov, the Soviet Army's chief military representative to the coalition headquarters, sent a classified assessment to Moscow that was later leaked to Western intelligence. His conclusions were damning. Soviet tank technology, he wrote, was at least 15 years behind American developments. The T-72's fire control system was inadequate for modern combat. Its ammunition could not defeat current American armor at any range. Its own armor was vulnerable to American weapons at distances where Iraqi crews couldn't even see their opponents. Most critically, he noted that classified reports predicting exactly these outcomes had been ignored by Soviet leadership for years. The mention of classified reports set off a frantic search through Ministry of Defense archives. Officers who had quietly preserved copies of Volkov's analysis brought them forward. The technical details he had provided matched precisely what coalition forces had demonstrated in combat. The vulnerabilities he had identified had proven exactly as severe as he predicted. The countermeasures he had proposed might have made a difference had they been implemented. Everything he had warned about had come true, and nobody had listened. Dmitry Volkov learned about the results of Desert Storm from television news broadcasts in his Moscow apartment. He watched footage of burning T-72s with a mixture of vindication and despair. He had tried. He had done everything possible within the system to prevent this. He had risked his life, his career, his freedom to obtain intelligence that could have changed outcomes, and the system had failed completely. In the months following the war, Volkov was quietly rehabilitated. He received visits from senior officers who wanted to understand how their institution had failed so catastrophically. He was asked to review his original analysis and provide updated assessments. He testified before internal committees investigating the intelligence failures that had led to the Gulf War disaster. But there was a hollowness to these acknowledgments. The tanks were already destroyed. The reputation of Soviet armor technology was already ruined. The export market that had generated billions in foreign currency was already collapsing as potential customers reconsidered their reliance on Soviet equipment. The impact of the Gulf War on the Soviet military-industrial complex cannot be overstated. Countries that had purchased Soviet weapons suddenly demanded refunds or cancellations. India, which operated thousands of T-72s, launched emergency modernization programs. Middle Eastern nations that had relied on Soviet equipment began negotiating with Western suppliers. The economic foundation of the Soviet defense industry, already weakened by the end of the Cold War, suffered a blow from which it would never fully recover. More devastating was the psychological impact on Soviet military professionals. For decades, they had believed they possessed equipment capable of challenging Western forces. This belief had shaped their doctrine, their training, their entire conception of how a future war would unfold. Now they knew the truth. Their tanks were death traps against American opponents. Their tactical doctrine was obsolete. Their entire approach to armored warfare needed fundamental reconsideration. Officers who had spent careers mastering Soviet methods found their expertise suddenly worthless. The T-72 itself became a symbol of Soviet failure. In the years following the Gulf War, the tank appeared in conflict after conflict with similarly dismal results. In Chechnya, Russian T-72s proved vulnerable to relatively simple anti-tank weapons, with crews suffering horrendous casualties from ammunition cook-offs when their vehicles were penetrated. The export market for the tank collapsed almost completely, with only the most price-conscious buyers willing to accept a vehicle with such a well-documented record of vulnerability. The pride of Soviet armor had become a cautionary tale. Volkov remained in Moscow through the collapse of the Soviet Union and the chaotic years that followed. He retired from intelligence work in 1993 and spent his remaining years writing a memoir that would never be published. The manuscript, later obtained by Western researchers, provided a detailed account of his intelligence operations and the institutional failures that had rendered them meaningless. He died in 2007. Largely unknown to the public, but remembered by professionals on both sides who understood what he had accomplished and how thoroughly it had been wasted. The lessons of Volkov's story extend far beyond the specific question of tank armor technology. His experience illustrates a fundamental problem that affects large organizations everywhere: the tendency to reject information that challenges established beliefs and threatens institutional interests. The Soviet military and industrial complex was not uniquely susceptible to this problem. Similar dynamics have produced intelligence failures in every major nation, including the United States. The difference is that the Soviet system, with its rigid hierarchies and political constraints, was particularly resistant to the kind of critical self-examination that might have prevented disaster. Consider what might have happened if Volkov's intelligence had been taken seriously. Soviet engineers, given accurate information about Chobham armor, might have developed effective countermeasures years before the Gulf War. They might have modified T-72 ammunition to improve its penetration performance against composite armor. They might have upgraded Soviet tanks with better fire control systems and thermal imaging capabilities. They might have developed new tactical doctrines that minimize the range advantages of American tanks. None of these measures would have eliminated American superiority, but they might have made the disparity less catastrophic. Instead, the Soviet leadership chose denial. They chose to believe what was comfortable rather than what was true. They chose institutional loyalty over operational effectiveness. And when reality finally imposed itself in the Iraqi desert, the price was paid by crews who had no idea how vulnerable they were. The human cost of this failure deserves acknowledgement. The Iraqi tankers who died in their T-72s were not monsters. They were soldiers doing their duty, operating equipment they had been told was effective, following orders from commanders who believed they had a chance. Many of them were conscripts with minimal training. Many had families waiting for them back home. They died because their government bought equipment that couldn't protect them, and because the nation that designed that equipment refused to acknowledge its limitations. There's a particular cruelty in dying inside a burning tank. The T-72, like most Soviet designs, stored its ammunition in an autoloader carousel beneath the turret. When this ammunition was penetrated, it detonated with catastrophic force, often blowing the turret completely off the hull and instantly killing the entire crew. American tankers came to call this phenomenon the jack-in-the-box effect, for the way turrets would fly upward from destroyed vehicles. It was an efficient way to ensure that penetrations were fatal, a design choice that prioritized rate of fire over crew survival. The Iraqi crews who died in these explosions never had a chance to escape. The Gulf War established American armored superiority so comprehensively that it shaped military thinking for a generation. The M1 Abrams became a symbol of American technological prowess, a weapon system that had performed even better than its designers had hoped. The tank's reputation attracted additional funding for upgrades and improvements, ensuring that American armor would maintain its edge for decades to come. The psychological impact on potential adversaries was equally significant. Nations that might have considered challenging American military power directly reconsidered when they saw what happened to Iraqi armor. For Russia, the successor state to the Soviet Union, the lessons of the Gulf War prompted a complete reconsideration of armored vehicle design. New tanks like the T-90 incorporated reactive armor, improved fire control systems, and enhanced crew protection features that directly addressed the vulnerabilities exposed in Desert Storm. Yet even these modernized vehicles remained objects of skepticism, their reputation forever tainted by the performance of their predecessors. The shadow of the Gulf War extended over Russian armor exports for decades, forcing manufacturers to compete on price rather than perceived quality. The intelligence dimension of the story remained classified for many years, known only to specialists with access to appropriate archives. Western intelligence agencies had their own sources within the Soviet system, and they were aware of Volkov's reports and their reception. American analysts found it almost amusing that their opponents had obtained accurate intelligence about Abrams' capabilities and then refused to act on it. The episode became a case study in the limitations of intelligence without institutional willingness to accept uncomfortable truths. Volkov himself never sought public recognition for his work. He understood that intelligence officers operate in shadows and that the value of their efforts often becomes apparent only in retrospect, if ever. He had done his job to the best of his ability. The failure lay not in his intelligence collection, but in the system that couldn't process what he provided. This was cold comfort for a man who had risked everything to obtain information that might have saved lives, but it was all the comfort available. The 100 hours of ground combat in Operation Desert Storm represented more than just a military victory. They represented the definitive end of Soviet military credibility. the final demonstration that the Cold War competition had produced a clear winner in the realm of conventional military technology. The images of burning T-72s became iconic representations of this reality, visual proof that decades of Soviet claims about military capability had been fundamentally incorrect. For students of military history, the Gulf War serves as a reminder that technological advantage matters enormously in modern warfare. The bravery and determination of Iraqi crews counted for nothing against opponents they couldn't see, couldn't hit, and couldn't harm. All the tactical skill in the world becomes irrelevant when your weapons can't penetrate enemy armor, and their weapons can penetrate yours at 3 times your effective range. The Iraqis fought the war they were equipped to fight. The Americans fought the war of the future. But technology alone doesn't explain the outcome. The Americans also benefited from superior training, better doctrine, and more effective command and control. Their crews had practiced extensively in realistic exercises. Their officers had studied armored warfare in detail. Their logistics system kept tanks supplied with fuel, ammunition, and maintenance. Every aspect of the American military system was optimized for the kind of fight they ended up facing, while the Iraqi system was optimized for a very different kind of conflict. The institutional lessons are perhaps the most enduring aspect of this story. Every large organization faces the challenge of processing uncomfortable information. Every bureaucracy develops institutional interests that can conflict with its stated mission. Every system of experts can become so invested in their expertise that they reject evidence challenging their conclusions. The Soviet military-industrial complex was an extreme example of these tendencies, but the tendencies themselves are universal. Volkov's experience shows what happens when these institutional pathologies are not corrected. He did everything right. He recruited a valuable source. He obtained critical intelligence. He analyzed it thoroughly and presented it clearly. He followed up persistently when his initial reports were ignored. He exhausted every avenue available within his system to get his warnings heard, and none of it mattered because the system wasn't designed to hear warnings like his. The question this raises for any organization is uncomfortable but essential. What mechanisms exist to ensure that critical information reaches decision-makers even when that information challenges established assumptions? What protections exist for analysts who deliver unwelcome news? How can institutions balance the need for expertise and confidence with the need for intellectual humility and openness to new data? These questions don't have easy answers, but the Gulf War demonstrated the catastrophic consequences of getting them wrong. In the years since the Gulf War, the M1 Abrams has continued to evolve. New variants incorporate improved armor, more powerful engines, and enhanced electronic systems. The tank has seen combat in Iraq and Afghanistan, performing well against the kinds of threats encountered in those conflicts. Its reputation for crew protection remains strong, with tankers expressing confidence in a vehicle that has consistently brought them home alive from dangerous situations. The T-72 has also continued to evolve, though its development has been overshadowed by the Gulf War's legacy. Modernized variants address many of the specific vulnerabilities that proved so fatal in 1991, with improved fire control, better ammunition, and enhanced armor protection. Yet these improvements came too late to change perceptions, and the tank remains associated with the burning wrecks of Desert Storm rather than any subsequent improvements. Dmitry Volkov's story became known to the wider public only gradually, through declassified documents and memoirs from participants on various sides. His contribution to understanding one of the Cold War's most significant intelligence failures was recognized by historians and analysts who studied the period in detail. He never received official acknowledgement from his own government for what he had accomplished, though the private acknowledgments from professionals who understood his work provided some measure of recognition. The memorial he might have wanted doesn't exist. There's no statue to the spy who tried to save 2,000 tanks. There is no plaque commemorating the intelligence that was ignored. There is only the historical record, the archive of documents and testimonies that piece together what happened and why. For those who take the time to examine this record, Volkov emerges as a tragic figure, a competent professional undone by the incompetence of his superiors. His warning about the M1 Abrams proved prescient in every particular. The armor was as formidable as he reported. The fire control system was as accurate as he described. The thermal imaging capabilities were as effective as his sources indicated. Every technical detail in his reports was confirmed by combat results in the Iraqi desert. He had provided his government with a roadmap for addressing their most significant military vulnerability, and they had chosen to ignore it. The cost of that choice was measured in destroyed vehicles and lost lives. 2,000 tanks reduced to burning wreckage. Crews incinerated inside machines they believed would protect them. An entire military establishment humiliated before the world. And somewhere in Moscow, an aging intelligence officer watching it all unfold on television, knowing he had tried to prevent it, knowing his efforts had been for nothing. This is the true tragedy of intelligence work. Success means preventing disasters that never happen, achievements that go unrecognized because the evidence of what they prevented doesn't exist. Failure means catastrophes that everyone can see, disaster that become historical footnotes and case studies and cautionary tales. Volkov experienced the worst possible outcome, providing intelligence that was accurate and actionable, watching his warnings ignored, and then witnessing the consequences he had predicted unfold exactly as he feared. The 100 hours of Operation Desert Storm lasted longer in their consequences than anyone involved understood at the time. They reshaped global military thinking. They accelerated the collapse of the Soviet military-industrial complex. They established American military dominance for a generation. They created reputations and destroyed others, and they validated the lonely warnings of a Soviet spy who had tried to save his country's tanks and been ignored for his trouble. History remembers the victors. The American tankers who destroyed Iraqi armor became heroes of a new kind of warfare, representatives of a military machine that seemed almost invincible. Their commanders received promotions and accolades. Their equipment became objects of worldwide admiration. The M1 Abrams entered the pantheon of legendary weapon systems, proof that American engineering could produce machines that outclassed any competitor. History is less kind to those who warned of defeat and were ignored. Volkov appears in footnotes and specialized studies, known to experts but anonymous to the broader public. His contribution to understanding the Cold War's military balance has been recognized by scholars, but this recognition came too late to change anything. He tried to serve his country through the means available to him. His country's institutions proved incapable of accepting what he offered. The Gulf War ended on February 28, 1991, got to exactly 100 hours after ground operations began. In those 100 hours, the American military demonstrated capabilities that exceeded even optimistic expectations. In those 100 hours, Soviet military technology suffered a defeat from which its reputation never recovered. In those 100 hours, the warnings of a spy named Dmitry Volkov were confirmed in the most dramatic and costly way possible. Moscow had ignored the spy who stole M1 Abrams' secrets. It cost them 2,000 T-72s in 100 hours. It cost them their credibility. It cost them their export market. It cost them the lives of crews operating equipment they believed would protect them. And it cost Dmitry Volkov any hope that his sacrifice had meant something, any possibility that his years of dangerous work had served a purpose. The desert has reclaimed most of the battlefield where these events unfolded. The burned-out hulks of T-72s have been salvaged for scrap or buried by shifting sands. The veterans on both sides have aged, many of them passing from the scene entirely. The Cold War that produced this confrontation has ended, replaced by new conflicts and new weapons and new rivalries. But the lessons remain. Intelligence without institutional willingness to act is worthless. Technology that isn't understood can't be countered. Bureaucratic interests that override operational requirements produce catastrophic failures, and the warnings of those who see clearly are often ignored by those who prefer comfortable illusions. Dmitry Volkov understood all of this in the end. He had served a system that couldn't process what he provided, and he had watched that system's failure unfold in real time. His story is not a triumphant narrative of intelligent success, but a cautionary tale of institutional failure. It reminds us that having information is not the same as using it, that seeing clearly is not the same as acting wisely, that the most accurate intelligence in the world means nothing if the people who receive it refuse to believe. 2,000 tanks burned in the desert because Moscow wouldn't listen. A spy spent his career obtaining intelligence that could have changed outcomes. An institution chose denial over adaptation and paid the price in destroyed equipment and lost credibility. These are the facts of the story, documented in archives and confirmed by witnesses on multiple sides. The desert winds still blow across the battlefield where Soviet armor met American technology and lost. The sand covers what remains of those terrible 100 hours. But the lessons of what happened there, the lessons that Dmitry Volkov tried to teach before they were written in fire and blood, remain as relevant as ever. Intelligence matters, institutions matter, the willingness to hear uncomfortable truths matters most of all, and sometimes, despite everything, the warnings go unheeded. The tanks burn anyway, the lives are lost anyway, and those who tried to prevent it are left with nothing but the cold satisfaction of having been right about something they would have given anything to be wrong about. That is the story of the spy who stole M1 Abrams secrets. That is the story of the 2,000 tanks that Moscow lost because they wouldn't listen. That is the story of Dmitry Volkov, who did everything right and watched everything go wrong anyway. Some lessons are only learned through failure. Some prices are only understood after they've been paid. And some warnings, no matter how accurate, no matter how urgent, no matter how clearly they predict what is coming, are simply ignored until the consequences become impossible to deny. The 100 hours of Desert Storm taught those lessons. The burning T-72s paid that price, and Dmitry Volkov's ignored warnings became one more example of how institutions fail when they choose comfort over truth. The story ends there. In the desert, in the archives, in the memory of those who lived through it and understood what happened. The tanks that should have survived didn't. The spy who should have been celebrated wasn't. The lessons that should have been learned beforehand were only understood afterward. That is how history works sometimes. That is how institutions fail. That is how 2,000 tanks are lost in 100 hours because the people who could have prevented it chose not to listen to the spy who tried to warn them. Moscow ignored the spy who stole M1 Abrams secrets, and it cost them everything he said it would. The thermal sights of American tanks cut through the dust and darkness of the Iraqi desert with perfect clarity, while Soviet-designed tanks died without ever seeing their killers. The technological gap, that chasm between what the Soviets believed and what was true, became a graveyard for 2,000 tanks and the doctrine that produced them. Every burning T-72 was a testament to institutional failure, a memorial to warnings ignored, a monument to the consequences of choosing comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. The veterans of that war, American and Iraqi alike, carry the memories of those 100 hours with them still. The American tankers remember the strange, almost antiseptic quality of combat through thermal sights, the distant detonations of vehicles they killed at ranges that felt more like video games than warfare. The Iraqi survivors, those few who escaped their burning vehicles, remember the terror of fighting an enemy they couldn't see, the helplessness of weapons that couldn't harm their attackers, the slow realization that everything they had been told about their equipment was wrong. And somewhere in the archives, in folders marked classified and restricted, the reports of Dmitry Volkov gathered dust. His analysis of M1 Abrams armor, his predictions about combat outcomes, his recommendations for countermeasures that were never developed, his warnings that were never heeded, all of it accurate, all of it actionable, all of it ignored. The failure of Soviet intelligence in the Gulf War was not a failure of collection, it was a failure of utilization. The information was there, the analysts who could interpret it were there. The channels for communicating it to decision-makers existed. What didn't exist was the institutional capacity to accept information that challenged established beliefs and threatened powerful interests. That capacity is what distinguishes organizations that adapt from those that fail. That capacity is what the Soviet military or industrial complex lacked. The M1 Abrams remains in service with the United States Army more than 4 decades after its introduction. It has been upgraded repeatedly, incorporating new technologies and addressing new threats, but its fundamental design philosophy remains unchanged. Crew survival matters. Technological superiority matters. The ability to see and engage enemies at ranges they cannot match matters. These principles, validated so dramatically in the Gulf War, continue to guide American armored vehicle development. The T-72 too remains in service with numerous nations around the world. Budget-conscious militaries still acquire the tank and its derivatives because they offer reasonable capability at relatively low cost. But every purchase is shadowed by the Gulf War's legacy. Every acquisition accompanied by awareness of what happened when these vehicles faced American armor. The tank, that was supposed to represent Soviet military prowess, became instead a symbol of Soviet military limitations. Dmitry Volkov died, knowing that his work had been vindicated by events but rendered meaningless by institutional failure. His memoir, never published, sits in archives where researchers occasionally examine it for insights into Soviet intelligence operations and their limitations. He described the frustration of providing accurate intelligence to organizations incapable of acting on it, the despair of watching predictable disasters unfold, the bitter satisfaction of having been right about things he desperately wished he had been wrong about. The lessons he drew from his experience were not optimistic. Large organizations, he concluded, are structurally incapable of processing information that threatens their fundamental assumptions. The larger and more powerful the organization, the more resistant it becomes to uncomfortable truths. The more invested leadership becomes in particular policies or capabilities, the less willing they are to acknowledge evidence of their failure. These dynamics are not unique to Soviet institutions. They appear wherever human beings create hierarchical systems to manage complex challenges. His proposed solutions were modest and probably inadequate. He suggested creating channels for critical information that bypassed normal bureaucratic gatekeepers. He recommended institutionalizing devil's advocacy, requiring decision-makers to engage seriously with contrary evidence before committing to courses of action. He proposed connecting intelligence analysts more directly with the operational officers who would face the consequences of acting or failing to act on their assessments. None of these ideas were original. None of them fully addressed the depth of the problem he had experienced, but they represented his attempt to extract something useful from the failure he had witnessed. The 100 hours of Desert Storm demonstrated what modern military technology could accomplish when wielded by trained professionals against opponents who were technologically outmatched. The one-sided nature of the ground war shocked observers on all sides, who had expected a more competitive engagement. Iraqi forces had combat experience, they had defensive positions, they had numerical parity in the theater of operations. None of it mattered against an opponent who could see them when they couldn't see back, hit them when they couldn't hit back, kill them when they couldn't kill back. War is a test of systems as much as individuals. The American system, with all its flaws, produced tanks that protected their crews and weapons that destroyed their enemies. The Soviet system, with all its resources, produced tanks that became tombs for their crews and weapons that bounced off enemy armor. The difference was not just technology, but the institutional processes that produced and deployed that technology, the feedback loops that allowed for improvement, the willingness to acknowledge problems and address them. Dmitry Volkov had tried to provide feedback that could have improved Soviet systems. His intelligence identified specific problems with specific solutions, but the feedback was rejected because it threatened institutional interests that proved more powerful than institutional missions. The tank factories kept producing tanks that couldn't survive combat. The ammunition plants kept producing rounds that couldn't penetrate enemy armor. The training centers kept teaching tactics that no longer worked, and 2,000 tanks burned in the desert because no one with power wanted to hear what Volkov had to say. This is the ultimate lesson of his story. Information alone doesn't change outcomes. Institutions must be structured to receive information, process it honestly, and act on it effectively. When those structures fail, when bureaucratic interests override operational requirements, when comfortable beliefs prove more appealing than uncomfortable truths, then accurate intelligence becomes meaningless, and preventable disasters become inevitable. The spy who stole M1 Abrams' secrets did everything he could. He obtained the information, he analyzed it correctly, he communicated it clearly, he advocated for action persistently. He was right about everything important, and none of it mattered because the system he served couldn't process what he provided. 2,000 tanks? 100 hours, one spy who tried to warn them, and an institutional failure that turned accurate intelligence into meaningless paper, filed away in archives where it couldn't prevent the catastrophe it predicted. That is the story. That is the lesson. That is what happens when Moscow ignores the spy who steals M1 Abrams' secrets. The desert knows, the archives remember, and the burned-out hulks of 2,000 tanks stand as monuments to the cost of institutional failure, the price of comfortable lies, and the tragedy of warnings ignored until it was too late to heed them.